I wasn't going to originally talk about this, but I've been playing so much Fellowship the last week, and I want to talk about it. I don't want to really make comparisons from World of Warcraft to Fellowship, but I do want to discuss what I've really enjoyed about this game. If you aren't familiar with Fellowship, let me just sum it up for you really quick. It's basically just Mythic Plus, where you queue with 3 other players to complete dungeons. There's your classic Holy Trinity, which is you have a tank, you have a healer, and you have 2 DPS. Unlike World of Warcraft, you don't need to level, you just pick a hero and you dive right in. The goal of the game is pretty much one-dimensional, and it's just to push up your dungeon score as high as possible alongside your gear and item level, which it does eventually cap out. You simply do that by doing more dungeons. So you complete dungeons, you get gear, and that's it. Very simple gameplay loop. The progression is straightforward. You are going to start with contender difficulty, and in order to move up, you need to complete what people call a capstone dungeon for that difficulty. So there's 5 total difficulties. So you have contender, then you move on to adept, then champion, then paragon, and then once you complete paragon, you begin progressing the eternal difficulty. Similar to World of Warcraft or other, I guess, ARPGs like Diablo, the progression is one-dimensional. Your goal is to push score by collecting the best gear and figuring out synergies between your tier sets and gems as your power level increases. With that out of the way, let's talk about why I love this game and why I have an embarrassingly amount of hours in it so far. So I've been blasting as the hero Helena. She is your standard sword and board kind of tank. While I wanted to play the monk, I got scared when I saw that she had a difficulty rating of 4 stars. I'm smart enough to know that I'm not that smart, so I wanted something a little bit easier to play. Interestingly enough, the combat of Fellowship I personally don't think is anything spectacular. Actually, after playing Fellowship for the last week or so, I find myself enjoying World of Warcraft's gameplay just so much more. But I want to focus on the elements of the game that I really like. So the first thing that seems to be the most talked about is actually the ability not only to set your focus kick to a specific target, but that your character's profile picture will attach to the nameplate. Beyond that, once a cast begins that can be interrupted, as long as your interrupt is available, your picture or little frame will glow. And beyond that, it also shows the cooldown of each individual kick attached to the nameplate for everyone to see. This is such a phenomenal way to show interrupts without requiring complicated tracking through, I don't know, weak auras or voice communication. So I think this is just so cool. Beyond that, there are very few games that exist where I think boss design is good, intriguing, and most importantly, memorable. And obviously there's the factor of like replayability. Fellowship, I think, has done a really good job at creating memorable and interesting encounters. In one of the dungeons, Everdawn Grove, you have to protect this little moosey boy who's running around the room by aiming arrows away and shielding it from certain mechanics. One of the longer capstone dungeons actually has 2 of my favorite encounters in this entire game. The first boss submerges the encounter space with a high tide that requires your group to like anchor themselves to the boss and dodge charging sharks. It's not just that mechanic, but it's the actual flooding and the VX of the actual like phase. Not only does the entire room submerge, but it also affects the sounds of your abilities and your champions when they are like shouting their abilities that they're using. The second boss in here, and while I generally hate tank mechanics, I don't really like tank mechanics that like requires the tank not to partake in combat. Basically, this boss has the tank rolling a giant ball around the room, picking up piles of gold to empower the ball. The bigger the ball, the more damage it does, and the boss will heal based on the coin piles on the ground. So having this little task, while it's not common, it's just like a fun gimmicky mechanic that you don't really have to worry about your damage, and your goal is to like keep the encounter space clean, navigating this ball around, avoiding tornadoes, and of course your players. Don't get me wrong, there's like some pretty boring fights in Fellowship, but overall I've been finding myself way more engaged in the combat of these boss mechanics, not just from a mechanical point of view, but also just the way it looks, the vibes, as they say. One unique feature of this game is actually mob design. There are 12 total dungeons in this game, and I really like the approach that Fellowship took. In a game like World of Warcraft, there's almost no overlap of dungeon mobs. The mobs in Floodgate are specific to the mobs in Floodgate. The mobs in Halls of Atonement are specific to the mobs in Halls of Atonement. But in a game, in Fellowship, what they've done is kind of interesting. So in WoW, while the mechanics, might be similar, there's a frontal here, there's a kick here, players need to, or at least feel pressured to try to learn all the mechanics, which can be an overwhelming task. What's interesting about Fellowship is their kind of copy and paste technique with some of the dungeon mobs. So you're going to see overlap between some dungeons where you're going to see a specific caster in 3 of the 12 dungeons. So when you might be in a new environment, you are familiar at least with the mobs and how to counter their abilities. Funnily enough, I love how short the dungeons are in this game. Most of the shorter dungeons have a timer of like less than 15 minutes, or some even leaning closer to 10, and that doesn't even factor in like player power being able to speed run these dungeons. The fast-paced gameplay and one boss dungeon design, I think, is a much better, like, it's such a good commitment for players who can't play that much. You can log in and you can get a couple dungeons done, not requiring hours of your time. Of course, I had the perks of playing with a pre-made group, but even when I do solo queue, at least as a tank, I get into a run pretty immediately. And last but not least, my favorite element of Fellowship falls into the tank role specifically. I can't express how insane the control is when it comes to your CC abilities. The champion or hero that I've been playing, Helena, specifically has a unique ability called Grand Melee, which has completely changed my perspective on how to make a tank feel impactful. So Grand Melee is essentially an aura that lasts for 10 seconds, that forces all mobs that are being affected by this aura to only melee attack the hero. So it's like a mixture of like an AoE silence and an AoE taunt. This is super nice for allowing the tank to easily like gather and move casters and archers. And if there's a complicated amount of mechanics coming up, or maybe your kicks are not available, you can pop Grand Melee or use Grand Melee and it'll silence all the mobs, allowing your group to kind of recover their CC and their kicks, or burst down a pack quickly within that time frame. Beyond Grand Melee, having a 12-second interrupt and additional CC like stuns just make tanking feel rewarding when it's executed correctly without being contingent on the damage you're dealing. So all in all, I really like the approach that Fellowship took to designing their classes and encounters. The most common comparison you'll hear about Fellowship is to World of Warcraft Mythic Plus. While you can easily draw similarities, ultimately they are 2 different games with, I think, different design philosophies. Fellowship is more of a fast-paced grindfest, where World of Warcraft at its core is still an MMO. I believe both games can learn from each other and also complement each other. Personally, I took the last week or so off of World of Warcraft to play Fellowship since there is a dip in the season, which actually worked out great while waiting for the Turbo Boost event. Similar to most RPGs or ARPGs, I know life it for a bit and then I'm gonna go back to playing WoW. Anyways, I'll just cut the video here. There's no reason for me to keep ranting, unless you want me to. I hope you guys enjoyed this slight change of pace from my usual World of Warcraft related content. Peace.